You see the stars up there? Well, no, Abram, you can't see them right now because it's daytime. But you know they're up there, right? You believe they're up there, right? Well, so shall your descendants be. You have that reference twice, in verse 12 and then once more. Let's see. Oh, in verse 17, when the sun had gone down. You have a sacrifice here. God tells Abram to bring these animals together, and this fire passes through them. Have you ever heard? I'm sure you have. Tell your friends what the fish you caught. No. Cross my heart. Hope to die. Stick a needle in my eye. You ever heard that before? Is that ever puzzling you? Cross my heart. Hope to die. Kind of morbid for kids, right? It's a medieval oath formula. Cross my heart. Cut it in 4 pieces. Hope to die. Stick a needle in my eye. In other words, there's a couple ways to have an oath or to swear a covenant oath. You can just swear positively, or sometimes a stronger version is this. It's a self-curse. If I'm lying to you, cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. So confident am I in what I'm saying that I bring upon myself the curse, the self-curse, if I'm unfaithful. If I'm unfaithful to you, may I be cursed. May you cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. It's a self-curse. Likewise, sometimes sacrificial imagery means just that may the person who's unfaithful to this covenant receive what happens to these animals if unfaithful. So in other words, God may be saying, you see these animals? The fire will pass through them, they'll be offered up. May that happen to me if I don't bring this about, Abraham or Abram. So one way of swearing an oath in the Old Testament is to have a self-curse. It's, who do we have swear oaths today? Politicians. There's a good example, right? Politicians, doctors, military, witnesses, right? No. These are people that you can't trust, but you have to. You simply have to. So who's going to be the guarantor? Well, think about a witness. I swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. There's a sense in which an oath, what you're doing is you're calling down divine blessing, you're calling down God's strength to help you do what you, at least in a tough situation, humanly speaking, probably wouldn't do or can't do, but with God's help you can. But the price of the help is also the curse. In other words, you call on God's help to help you do what you can't do on your own. But then if you're unfaithful, you're saying, if I lie, and nobody else knows it, who does? God does. And if nobody else can bring me to justice, someone else can or will eventually. So the oath is really bringing God's name into the picture. It's almost like a blank check. If I wrote a check to you for $1 million, we probably would throw it away and chuckle. But if I had Donald Trump's name next to mine, you might run and catch that thing, right? Well, the oath puts not only your name on it, but God's name. So you're calling down the blessing, the strength to do what you can't do on your own. But the price of that is the self-curse if you're unfaithful. Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. What we're going to see is God here is going to swear the oath. God will commit himself to work through Abraham to reunite the human family. Okay, in Genesis 15 here, you have the sacrifice, and then in 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Literally the Lord cut a covenant, cut a covenant, noting the connection with sacrifice and covenant. Cut a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. A reference to the Nile and the Euphrates there. So the land is solemnified. The promise of the land, which is what you're going to need to be a nation, is solemnified here to covenant status. This will be fulfilled, did we talk about this? With Moses. In 17, you have two references to king. Kings will come forth from Abraham's line here. Kings will come forth from Abraham's line, and God makes a covenant with him on that day. This will come to fruition with David. And especially when we look at this, what you're going to notice is a widening of the covenant. With Moses, it's a nation, with Israel. With David, it's a kingdom which will include the surrounding nations. With David, it'll be a kingdom which will include the surrounding nations. And for a brief period with David and Solomon, it prefigures what Christ will do. For a brief period with David and Solomon, while the kingdom is still united, it prefigures what Jesus will do. In Solomon's temple, there's a court for the Gentiles. All right, so now what you have is breaking open this universal scope of the covenant. Did I mention the wisdom literature in here at all? We'll talk about it more, but what you'll find arising with David and Solomon is this genre of literature known as the wisdom literature. And you'll note that there's a stark contrast between, say, Leviticus and the wisdom literature. In Leviticus, you'll find laws about ceremonial sacrifice, things that, and here's the key, things that are Israelite specific. Things that set Israel apart from the nations. Differentiate Israel from the nations. Demarcate, keep apart Israel from the nations. What you find with David and Solomon is that other nations are being brought into the covenant, and this wisdom literature, which is something of a Davidic or new Torah, a new law, if you will, goes like this. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Justice, righteousness, equity. You see this in Proverbs, the Psalms, Job, Ecclesiastes. What are we getting at here? That's not the kind of thing that sets Israel apart. It's the kind of thing that the nations can understand. It's prefiguring what Jesus will do when we say the Sermon on the Mount. Yes, Matthew 5-7. In other words, and we're going to see this, the reason for the various laws that are given at various moments is specific to what God is doing with His people at that time. Israel will need to be set apart because when she's with the nations, she's like the nations. But that's not the end in itself. The end is strengthening Israel so that she can be like the nations, as was her calling all along. You see that being prefigured here, but ultimately, this will be with Jesus, where he'll be with his disciples. He'll begin with Israel, you might say. But then in Matthew 28, for example, it'll say, "Go out and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." In other words, now it's time, especially with the coming of the Holy Spirit, to go out and be light of the world. Now it's time not to hide in a corner, not to exclude ourselves, but to open up to the universal scope of the covenant that was planned all along, back in Genesis 12. Any questions there? That's kind of a summary of the course in some ways, or a big part of the course. So make sure you got these promises and what's going on here. This is one of the few times where I will guarantee you it will show up on an exam.
So promises are God's promises right there.
Yeah, you consider them as elevated covenants. This one in 15, this one in 17, this one in 22. So they're sort of systematically reinforced. So is that?
What is the WWDC?
Worldwide blessing.